20 मार्च का दिन हमारे निर्भया के नाम, हमारे देश के बच्चियों के नाम, हमारे देश के महिलाओं के नाम, देर से ही सही देश के बच्चियों को इंसाफ मिला।
The 4 convicts in the Nirbhaya gang rape and murder case were hanged to death at 5:30 a.m. in Delhi's Tihar jail on 20th March 2020, 7 years after the gruesome crime took place. Akshay Thakur, Mukesh Singh, Vinay Sharma and Pawan Gupta were the convicts who were awarded the death sentence.
On a chilly December night in 2012, a young woman and her friend boarded what appeared to be a routine bus ride home in the bustling city of Delhi. The streets were alive with movement, the hum of daily life continuing as usual. But behind the closed doors of that bus, something far more sinister was about to unfold. What started as an ordinary journey quickly turned into a night of unimaginable horror, one that would haunt the nation forever. 6 men lurked in the shadows, their intentions hidden beneath deceitful smiles. The moment the bus veered off its intended path, it became a rolling chamber of terror, a prison from which there was no escape. What followed was unimaginable brutality. The young was not only beaten and gang brutalized by 6 men, but she was also subjected to unspeakable violence when a metal rod was forced into her, causing severe damage to her organs. When questioned by investigators, the perpetrators shockingly justified their actions by claiming that she was not well dressed. Such a response underscores the deep-rooted misogyny and disregard for human dignity that perpetuates these heinous acts. This crime against humanity sparked nationwide outrage, igniting a relentless fight for justice and reform. It served as a turning point in India's ongoing struggle for women's safety, pushing society and lawmakers to confront the urgent need for change. No woman deserves such brutality. Women must be protected at all costs, and crimes like these remind us of the critical importance of ensuring a safer and more just world for everyone. Welcome to the Crime Series. I'm glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you're watching from. On December 16, 2012, in Delhi, a city alive with its usual hustle, the streets were crowded with people heading home from work, shoppers filling the markets in preparation for the holiday season, and young crowds enjoying the nightlife that the metropolis had to offer. Among them were 23-year-old Jyoti Singh and her companion, Awindra Pratap Pandey, who had just spent the evening watching Life of Pi at a shopping mall in Saket. The movie, a story of survival, seemed fitting in hindsight, though neither of them could have known that their own struggle for survival was about to begin. Jyoti was a woman of ambition, resilience, and a quiet strength that had carried her through hardships. Born on December 10, 1989, in Balia, a small town in Uttar Pradesh, she had grown up in a modest family that valued education above all else. Her parents had worked tirelessly to ensure she had the opportunities they never did, and she, in turn, had dedicated herself to her studies, determined to become a doctor. Moving to Delhi to study physiotherapy had been a dream realized, and despite financial struggles, she remained focused, knowing that her success would lift her family. She was kind and intelligent, full of life and dreams, with a deep sense of responsibility toward those she loved. Her father, a loader at the Delhi airport, and her mother, a homemaker, saw her as the beacon of hope for their family. She had 2 younger brothers who admired her fiercely, and to them she was more than a sister. She was their guide, their protector. Awindra, her companion that night, was a 28-year-old software engineer from Gorakhpur. He, too, had come to Delhi to build a better future. Quiet but confident, he carried himself with a sense of responsibility that was evident in the way he treated Jyoti. Their relationship was one of deep friendship and mutual respect. Whether they were romantically involved or simply good friends remained a matter of speculation, but what was undeniable was the trust they had in each other. It was an ordinary evening, a simple night out after long hours of work and study, an attempt to unwind before returning to the daily grind. As the film ended and they stepped out of the mall, they made their way to Munirka, a busy area in South Delhi, looking for transport to head home. It was past 8:30 p.m., and like most nights in the city, finding a safe and reliable ride was not easy. Auto rickshaws were either unavailable or charging exorbitant fares. Public buses were scarce at that hour, and the ones that did run were often overcrowded and unsafe. As they waited, a white private bus pulled up near them. The conductor leaned out, calling for passengers, insisting that it was heading in their direction. They hesitated briefly, uncertain about taking a private bus, but it seemed like a safer option than waiting in the cold. There were already a few people inside other passengers, or so it seemed. With no reason to suspect danger, they stepped inside. As soon as they sat down, the bus doors shut and the vehicle sped off. Within moments, an uneasy feeling crept in. Something was wrong. The men inside did not behave like regular passengers. Their eyes, their posture, the way they whispered to each other, it was unsettling. Awindra noticed the driver watching them through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable but cold. The bus was not following the expected route. Instead of heading toward their destination, it veered off the main road, moving deeper into the city's dark, quieter lanes. The realization struck them like a punch. They were alone in a vehicle with 6 strangers, and the exit had disappeared behind them. Their fear was met with immediate violence. When Awindra questioned their route, the men turned on him, hurling abuse before launching a brutal attack. They beat him with an iron rod, overpowering him easily, their blows precise and cruel, designed to break him down quickly. Jyoti, terrified but defiant, tried to intervene, pleading for mercy, but her words were met with laughter. It was then that the horror truly began. The streets outside bustled with people unaware of the terror occurring just beyond their reach. In a city known for its contradictions, modern yet unsafe, progressive yet plagued by deep-rooted misogyny, one of the most brutal acts of violence ever recorded in India's history was beginning to unfold. As the bus moved through the dimly lit streets of Delhi, Jyoti and Awindra realized they were trapped. The men inside, who had seemed like passengers, were actually predators waiting for their moment. The bus was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a moving cage, cutting them off from the outside world. Awindra, still reeling from the sudden attack, tried to fight back. He yelled for help, hoping someone outside would hear him. But the bus kept speeding through the city, and the men only laughed at his desperation. The doors had been locked, and the windows were covered with dark curtains, making sure no one could see inside. Then they turned to Jyoti. She trembled, but she did not surrender to fear. She pleaded with them to let them go, but they ignored her words. Instead, they surrounded her, their expressions cold and cruel. She held on to Awindra, but he was badly injured, struggling to even stay on his feet. Before he could react, they hit him again, this time harder. The iron rod struck his body over and over until he collapsed, unable to move. With Awindra lying helpless on the floor, they set their sights on Jyoti. She fought back with all her strength, kicking and resisting, but the men were relentless. They took turns sexually assaulting her, their brutality beyond comprehension. They used the iron rod as a weapon. Defied human cruelty. The pain was unbearable, and yet they did not stop. The bus kept moving, the driver ensuring that no one outside would suspect what was happening inside. Time lost meaning as the assault continued. Jyoti drifted in and out of consciousness, but her nightmare did not end. Every time Awindra tried to crawl toward her, they beat him down again, laughing at his helplessness. Their cruelty knew no limits. To them she was not a person, just a victim they could use and discard. As the ordeal continued, Jyoti's attempts to fight back, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, were a testament to her strength. According to police reports, she left bite marks on 3 of the attackers, a small but significant act of defiance. She would not go quietly into the night. But despite her bravery, the situation was dire. After what felt like an eternity, they decided they were done. They stripped both Jyoti and Awindra of their clothes, stealing anything that could link them to the crime. Without a moment's hesitation, they opened the bus doors and threw them out onto the cold road, leaving them naked and barely alive. The bus sped away into the night, its passengers believing they had erased all traces of their crime. Lying on the roadside, Jyoti and Awindra clung to life. They had no clothes, no way to call for help, and their wounds were excruciating. The December night was freezing, adding to their suffering. Despite his pain, Awindra crawled toward Jyoti, desperate to check if she was still breathing. She was alive, but only just. Cars passed by, their headlights flashing over the wounded couple, but no one stopped. People saw them, yet fear kept them from intervening. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, someone called the police. An ambulance arrived, and they were rushed to the hospital. But the horror of that night was far from over. Jyoti's injuries were so severe that even experienced doctors were horrified. The battle for survival and the fight for justice had only just begun. The ambulance tore through the dark streets of Delhi, its siren wailing as it rushed toward Safdarjung Hospital. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Jyoti lay on the stretcher, barely clinging to consciousness, her body shattered from the unimaginable cruelty she had endured. Every breath she took was labored, her face pale from the massive blood loss. Awindra, though severely beaten, refused to rest. His head throbbed from the blows, his body ached with bruises, but his mind was focused only on her. He kept calling her name, hoping for a response. Sometimes she would faintly move her fingers, a sign that she was still fighting. But she was slipping, her body growing colder with every passing moment. As soon as they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to the emergency ward. The medical team was prepared for critical cases, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw that night. If you found this story compelling and appreciate the way we bring real-life cases to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and share these important stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Jyoti's injuries were beyond anything they had ever witnessed. The brutality was unimaginable. Her skin bore deep wounds, and her body showed signs of an assault so violent that it defied logic. Her system had been severely damaged due to the iron rod used in the attack, a level of inhumanity that left even experienced doctors shaken. Within minutes, a team of surgeons was called. They knew that every second mattered. Jyoti was taken into surgery, where they worked tirelessly to repair the damage done to her fragile body. The internal bleeding was extensive, and her condition was unstable. Each incision the doctors made revealed more trauma, more destruction. They fought to save her, stitching wounds, cleaning out the infections that had already begun to spread, and administering pain relief to ease her suffering. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Awindra sat with police officers despite his own injuries. His face was swollen, his limbs bruised, but he pushed aside his pain to give his statement. He described the bus, the attackers, the way they had been lured in under false pretenses. He recalled how many men were involved, their brutal laughter as they carried out the assault, and the sheer horror of being powerless to stop them. He told them about the iron rod, about how they had tossed them onto the road like garbage when they were done. His voice trembled as he spoke, but his determination never wavered. He needed to make sure they were caught. Outside the hospital, word of the crime spread like wildfire. By morning, the news channels were filled with reports of the brutal attack. The details were so horrifying that the entire country seemed to stop in shock. People were outraged. Crowds gathered outside Safdarjung Hospital, demanding justice. Protesters held up signs, their voices echoing through the streets. Women and men, young and old, stood together in anger and grief. This was not just about Jyoti. This was about the thousands of women who had been harassed, assaulted, and silenced. This was about a country that had ignored the suffering of its daughters for too long. Inside the hospital, Jyoti's parents' faces etched with worry and pain. Her father, a hard-working man who had sacrificed so much to educate his daughter, stood beside her, holding her cold hands. He whispered to her, telling her to stay strong, to fight. Her mother, unable to bear the sight of her daughter in such agony, wept silently. They had always been proud of Jyoti, her strength, her intelligence, her dreams. Now, all they could do was hope she would survive. Despite the surgeries, Jyoti's condition remained critical. Her body had suffered too much, and the doctors knew the risk of infection was dangerously high. They did everything they could, but they also understood that her survival depended on more than just medical treatment. It depended on her will to live. As Jyoti lay in her hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body fought against the unimaginable pain and severe infections that had begun to spread. The doctors had done everything they could, multiple surgeries, intensive care, and strong medications, but the damage was devastating. Even though her body was breaking, her spirit remained strong. Whenever she regained consciousness, she tried to communicate, answering the police officers' questions in a faint voice, giving details of what had happened, and also telling her mother that she wanted to live. She wanted to study, to become a doctor, to help others. But even as she spoke, her voice was weak, her strength fading. She was not just a victim, she was a fighter. Beyond the walls of Safdarjung Hospital, something extraordinary was happening. What had started as whispers of horror in the streets of Delhi soon erupted into a nationwide outcry. The brutality of the crime had struck a nerve, igniting anger and grief across the country. It was as if something inside the people had snapped. They had heard stories of sexual violence before. They had read reports, seen news segments, and perhaps even witnessed the fear that women carried every day. But this time, they refused to stay silent. In Delhi, the protests began as small gatherings outside the hospital, where people held candles, prayed for Jyoti's recovery, and demanded justice. But as the details of the crime spread, so did the outrage. Crowds poured into the streets, their numbers growing by the hour. By evening, thousands had gathered at India Gate, one of the country's most symbolic landmarks. The scene was both powerful and heartbreaking. Young students, working professionals, elderly citizens, mothers with their daughters, fathers with their sons, all standing together, their faces filled with determination and anger. The slogans echoed through the night. "We want justice. No more silence." People held up placards with haunting questions. When will women be safe? How many more before the law takes action? Some held pictures of Jyoti, calling her Nirbhaya, the fearless one. She had become a symbol, not just of suffering, but of resistance. The movement spread beyond Delhi. In Mumbai, Kolkata, Bangalore, Chennai, and smaller towns across India, people took to the streets. The anger was not just about this one crime. It was about years of injustice, about the countless cases that had been ignored or dismissed. It was about a society that had failed to protect its daughters. The protests were no longer just demonstrations. They had become a revolution, demanding change. The government and law enforcement were unprepared for this level of public outrage. Initially, they responded with caution, offering statements condemning the attack, promising swift action. But words were not enough. As the protests intensified, the authorities panicked. Barricades were set up, roads were blocked. When peaceful protesters refused to disperse, water cannons were used. Tear gas filled the air as officers attempted to push back the crowds. But instead of scaring them away, these actions only fueled the anger. The people were no longer afraid. They were tired of being ignored. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, Jyoti's condition continued to decline. The doctors knew they were running out of options. Infections had spread rapidly, her organs were failing, and her body was too weak to fight any longer. That they concluded, Jyoti will be transferred to a better and equipped hospital in Singapore. Her parents, who had been by her side since the night of the attack, watched helplessly. The news of her critical condition spread, deepening the country's grief. Protesters, who had been demanding justice, now found themselves praying for her survival. Television channels provided minute-by-minute updates, newspapers printed bold headlines, and social media exploded with messages of support. The entire nation was holding its breath. The government, under immense pressure, announced legal reforms. They moved Jyoti's case to a fast-track court, promising swift justice. Discussions began about stricter punishments for rapists, including the death penalty. Politicians, activists, and celebrities all voiced their support. But for the people on the streets, this was not just about making promises. It was about making real change. They wanted justice, not just for Jyoti, but for every woman who had been silenced by fear. On December 26, 2012, the Indian government, along with the support of the hospital, arranged for her to be airlifted, hoping that the medical team there would be able to provide her with better care. Jyoti was carefully placed in a specially equipped air ambulance, accompanied by a team of doctors and her parents. Every second of the journey was crucial, as her condition was extremely unstable. Her father sat beside her, watching helplessly as his daughter fought for life. Her mother clutched her hand, whispering prayers, silently pleading with the universe for a miracle. The flight was long and filled with uncertainty. No one knew if she would survive the journey. After battling for nearly 2 weeks, Jyoti Singh died on December 29, 2012, at the age of 23. Her death occurred in the early hours of the morning at Mount Elizabeth Hospital in Singapore after she succumbed to her injuries. The cause of her death was reported as complications resulting from multiple organ failure due to the severity of the physical trauma and infections caused by the brutal assault. When news of her death reached India, it sent shockwaves through the country. The grief that had already consumed the nation deepened into something even stronger: rage, determination, and an unbreakable demand for justice. Protests that had been focused on punishment now expanded to demand real, lasting change. Crowds gathered in silence, lighting candles, holding up posters with Jyoti's name. In some places, people wept openly, grieving for a young woman they had never met, but had come to love like their own daughter. The country mourned, but at the same time, there was an undeniable sense of resolve that her death would not be in vain. For her parents, the loss was unbearable. Their daughter, who had worked so hard to achieve her dreams, who had fought for her life with the same determination she had shown in her studies, was now reduced to memories and tears. Her father, who had spent his life working tirelessly to give her the best education he could afford, had believed she would return home victorious. Her mother, who had held her hand in the hospital, whispering words of strength and love, had prayed for a miracle that never came. Now, instead of preparing for her future, they were preparing for her funeral. The Indian government, sensing the rising tension and unrelenting public outrage, arranged for Jyoti's body to be flown back to India. On December 30, 2012, her coffin arrived at Indira Gandhi International Airport, shrouded in white, symbolizing the life that had been taken too soon. It was a moment of profound sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of the young woman who had become more than just a victim. She had become a symbol of courage, of suffering, and of the desperate need for justice. Her funeral was a private affair, held in the early hours of the morning with only family and close friends present. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no grand processions, just the quiet grief of a family that had lost its brightest star. Her parents, shattered beyond words, performed the final rites, saying goodbye to their daughter in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. A young woman with dreams of becoming a doctor, with hopes of building a better life for her family, was now reduced to ashes. Their first breakthrough came with the identification of the bus. It had been abandoned in a hidden area, but investigators quickly tracked it down. Inside the vehicle, they found damning evidence: stains, pieces of torn clothing, and fingerprints. The horrific events of that night had left undeniable traces inside the bus, painting a picture of the unimaginable violence that had taken place within its closed doors. Using CCTV footage from security cameras along the roads the bus had traveled, combined with information from Awindra and local witnesses, the police started to piece together the faces behind the crime. One by one, the 6 perpetrators were identified and arrested in rapid succession. The first to be caught was Ram Singh, the driver of the bus and the mastermind of the crime. He had a history of criminal behavior, yet had never faced serious consequences. He was the one who had initiated the plan that night, taking advantage of the empty bus and luring unsuspecting passengers into his trap. His younger brother, Mukesh Singh, was arrested soon after. He had assisted in overpowering Awindra, helping to control the victims while the others carried out the assault. The third and fourth men, Vinay Sharma and Pawan Gupta, were young men with no prior criminal records, but their role in the crime was just as brutal. They had participated actively in both the attack on Jyoti and the beating of Awindra. The fifth accused, Akshay Thakur, had been working as a cleaner on the bus. He had joined in the attack without hesitation, showing no remorse for the pain inflicted on the victims. The sixth and final accused, and the most controversial, was a 17-year-old juvenile whose name was withheld due to legal protections for minors. Despite being the youngest, he was later revealed to have been one of the most violent among them. Reports suggested that he had inflicted the most grievous injuries on Jyoti, displaying a level of cruelty that shocked even hardened investigators. With all 6 men now in police custody, the authorities began intense interrogations. Some of the accused denied their involvement, while others confessed without remorse. Ram Singh, in particular, showed no guilt, at times even smiling during questioning. The juvenile, despite his age, displayed an alarming lack of emotion. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. DNA tests, medical reports, and eyewitness accounts all confirmed their guilt. As details of the arrests became public, the outrage across India grew even stronger. People were horrified not only by the brutality of the crime, but also by the possibility that the juvenile accused could receive only a short sentence due to his age. Many questioned whether the existing laws were too lenient on violent offenders simply because they were under 18. The debate over juvenile justice laws spread across the nation, with thousands demanding that minors committing heinous crimes be tried as adults. The legal system responded swiftly. In a rare move, the government transferred the case to a fast-track court, ensuring that justice would not be delayed. Charges were filed against the accused for rape, murder, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. Legal experts stated that given the overwhelming proof, a conviction was inevitable. The 6 men responsible had been caught. Now, the real question remained: how long would it take for justice to be served? Would the legal system act swiftly, or would this case become another example of delayed justice? The search for the criminals was over, but the fight for justice had only just begun. For the first time, the country was watching the legal system with unwavering focus, refusing to allow delays, corruption, or inefficiencies to weaken the case. The public wanted nothing less than the maximum punishment for the 6 men who had committed one of the most horrific crimes in modern history. The legal proceedings began in January 2013, with security tightened around Saket Court in Delhi. Every time the accused were brought to court, the police had to shield them from angry crowds who shouted for their execution. The pressure on the judiciary was immense. This was not just a trial. It was a test of whether India's legal system could deliver the justice that the people demanded. Inside the courtroom, the evidence against the accused was overwhelming. The prosecution presented Jyoti's medical reports, forensic evidence, DNA tests, CCTV footage, and her dying statement, in which she had clearly identified the attackers. Each piece of evidence reinforced the brutality of the crime, making it clear that there was no room for doubt, no room for mercy. The most heart-wrenching moment came when Awindra, Jyoti's companion and the sole survivor of the attack, took the witness stand. His testimony was crucial. He was the only person alive who had witnessed the crime. He recounted in painful detail how he and Jyoti had been lured into the bus, how they were attacked without warning, and how she had been brutalized in a way no human should ever suffer. His voice trembled as he described his own helplessness, his inability to save her, and the unimaginable cruelty that had been inflicted upon her. The defense lawyers attempted to delay the trial by claiming that the accused had been forced into confessions and that there was not enough proof to sentence them to death. But the forensic reports, which matched the DNA of each accused to the crime scene, left no room for argument. Among the 6 accused, one became the center of immense national controversy: the juvenile suspect who was just a few months short of turning 18 at the time of the crime. Under Indian law, juveniles could not be given the death penalty or even a life sentence, no matter how horrific their crimes. The maximum punishment he could receive was 3 years in a juvenile reform facility. Mass protests erupted, demanding a change in the juvenile justice laws so that minors involved in heinous crimes could be tried as adults. The government promised to re-examine the law, but for Jyoti's case, the verdict had already been decided. The juvenile accused would serve only 3 years in a reform home, after which he would be released with a clean record. This decision deepened the frustration of the people, but legally, nothing could be done to change it. Meanwhile, Ram Singh, the bus driver and the ringleader of the group, was found dead in his prison cell in March 2013. The authorities claimed it was suicide, but his family and some prison officials suspected that he had been killed by fellow inmates. Whether it was an act of vengeance or an escape from justice, his death brought little relief. The fight for punishment was far from over. As the trial neared its conclusion, the 4 remaining adult accused faced the harshest possible charges: rape, homicide, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. The prosecution argued that this was the rarest of the rare cases and demanded the death penalty for all of them. On September 10, 2013, the court delivered its historic verdict. All 4 adult accused were found guilty on every charge. 3 days later, on September 13, 2013, the judge sentenced them to death by hanging. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Jyoti's parents wept, holding on to each other, knowing that justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, people celebrated. The verdict was seen as a victory not just for Jyoti but for every woman in India who had ever lived in fear. However, the legal battle did not end there. The convicts appealed their death sentence, first in the Delhi High Court, which upheld the verdict, and then in the Supreme Court, which also confirmed their execution in May 2017. Even after that, they filed multiple mercy petitions, dragging the process for years. Jyoti's parents continued to fight, attending every hearing, pushing back against every delay. They had already lost their daughter, but they refused to let her case become another forgotten tragedy. Finally, after 7 long years of legal battles, the final act of justice was carried out. On March 20, 2020, the 4 convicts were hanged at Tihar jail. Outside the prison, Jyoti's parents stood in silence, their eyes filled with tears. Her mother whispered that finally her daughter has received justice, but even as the execution was carried out, they knew that the fight was not over. Laws had changed, stricter punishments had been introduced, but women in India still faced violence every day. As they walked away from Tihar jail, her parents carried with them a new purpose: to ensure that no other woman in India would suffer the way their daughter had suffered. For Jyoti's parents, the fight was no longer just about their daughter. It was about ensuring a future where no other family would have to endure what they had gone through. They turned their pain into a movement, working to help other survivors of sexual violence, pushing for stronger laws, better safety measures, and faster trials for rape cases. The pursuit of justice for Jyoti had reached its conclusion, but the struggle for a safer India had only just begun. In response to the horrific crime, the Indian government implemented reforms, including the Nirbhaya Fund to enhance women's safety and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013, which introduced harsher penalties for sexual offenses. However, despite these measures, significant challenges persisted and funds were often underutilized, and survivors continued to face stigma, legal hurdles, and delays in obtaining justice. Reports of sexual violence remained alarmingly frequent, prompting the unsettling question: had anything truly changed? Women across India, in both urban and rural areas, still lived in fear, hesitant to report crimes due to the societal backlash and institutional failures that often followed. While laws had been strengthened, deeply ingrained issues such as police apathy, judicial delays, and victim blaming continued to obstruct progress. Jyoti's case became a symbol of defiance and change, sparking annual memorial gatherings, candlelight vigils, and sustained advocacy for women's rights. Her parents turned their unimaginable grief into a relentless campaign for justice, supporting survivors and demanding accountability from the system. The tragedy also forced Indian society to confront uncomfortable realities, leading to greater awareness and open discussions about consent, gender equality, and the urgent need for cultural transformation. Despite the progress made, systemic gender bias remained deeply rooted. Many survivors still struggled to have their voices heard, police responses remained inadequate, and legal battles dragged on for years. Jyoti, forever remembered as Nirbhaya, the fearless one, became an enduring symbol of courage and resistance. While her parents had once dreamed of seeing her thrive as a doctor, they now fought for a broader vision. India, where women could live without fear, where justice was swift, and where survivors were supported, not shamed. As time passed, one question remained unanswered. Had Jyoti's sacrifice led to genuine lasting change? Or was India still failing to protect its daughters? The legal system had evolved, but had societal attitudes transformed enough to create a truly safe and just world for women? The fight for gender equality and security was far from over.